Our urban age presents challenges of density, sustainability, social cohesion, and livability, but it's also an exciting time. Cities will shape the future, and the people in this room will be shaping those cities. If we want to reduce energy and resource use, if we want to grow a new economy and create a more equitable society, where we can do well and all the people in the city can do well, then cities are an amazing platform to do it. What are the elements that are involved? Great planning, as Jennifer mentioned, great design and architecture, arts and culture, and a government with a whole metropolitan vision. Our next panel will get us started on these subjects. Would you please welcome, and I'll ask them to come out. I hope they come out. John Cruickshank. John Cruickshank of the Toronto Star. Bryan Tuckey, President and CEO of BILD. Mary Rowe, Managing Director of the Municipal Art Society of New York, but also a Torontonian. Ewan Robertson, the new President and COO of Mars, who also spent some years at the New York Economic Development Corporation. And of course, the man who made ubiquity a small word, Sheldon Levy, President of the University at Ryerson. There's your panel and your chair.
Well, thank you, David. Can you hear me? Is it on? That's good. Thank you, and I'm not going to begin by repeating what has already been said, but rather just jump into it. In the back, when we were talking, the panelists, I showed Mary the questions, and Mary said to me, "Oh, you're going to go right into taxation and mill rates." Said, rather than that, why don't we begin at a higher level? And so, Mary, I'm going to begin with you. You said to me, why don't you ask me, what's the new deal for cities? So I'm going to put it right to you. So what's the new deal?
The first deal is it's just a shame we can't see who's here. There are some people out there, though, I'm assuming, because you know what the new deal for cities is better than we do. But I think what I was reacting to in the prep was this. I think that at these kinds of forums, we need to try to find a way to ask ourselves some of the bigger questions. I think it's difficult to do that, and the temptation is to get down into the nitty-gritty. You know, can't we get tolls? Can't we get this? Can't we get that? And, I appreciate the leadership that your chief planner is showing in trying to raise the bar and have you talk about things at a bigger level. What I would say is that I think the New Deal for Cities, a number of years ago when I was here in Toronto, a number of us were involved in advocating to the federal government for a different financial arrangement with cities. And what I think over time we've learned is that probably is a discussion that needs to happen in a much different way now. And that I have sort of in my own mind, now that I live in New York, and you can chorus in on here, even in New York City where we have a strong mayor system, the city there still does not have the kind of financial capacity or resources to really build the infrastructure and build the kind of systems that we need. So I always hope that here in Toronto we'll let go of some of that strong mayor envy and move to an understanding that actually powering and resourcing cities needs all hands on deck. It needs a really diverse set of instruments. And I don't think that I would encourage us to drop that kind of infantilizing mantra of give me more, it's the province that's the problem, oh the feds, I need more of the HST. I really think we have to talk much differently about how a city economically closes its loops and self-generates the wealth that it needs to.
John, do you want to?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, when you think back of about some of the models that began to emerge, and I think at a kind of higher level, there was this notion at one point that cities were going to develop into city states. And Toronto was going to be a city-state. Vancouver was going to be a city-state. There was even a suggestion that had already begun to evolve towards that. And it was so naive in a political sense because broader governments, with representation in many different environments, were never going to let that happen. They couldn't let that happen and stay in place. So I think part of what Mary's saying, and I think is absolutely right, is cities are going to have to define the value that they create for the rest of, in our case, the rest of Ontarians, the rest of Canadians. It's now incumbent, I think, upon cities to really begin to develop a sense of vision about what it is that's going to happen that's really special there, because they are going to require a different kind of treatment than the other jurisdictions that fall within this common government of Ontario or of Canada. And we have to speak to those special elements. And I think, frankly, we've got to speak to them in a very different way than we have been so far.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that, really right now I think Toronto's, and I think Jennifer said it well, is defining its future right now. And it's really past the planning stages in many of what we've done. It's time to execute. I know the Building Industry and Land Development Association, they're experts in their part of execution, and I think we have to build a framework that really does three things. It builds partnerships. You can't do any of this alone. Second, we need to find ways like this where you actually collaborate and work together to define and work towards a vision. And then the third is get alignment in all of our sectors to make things happen in the City of Toronto over the next number of years that actually define, build, and complete visions in their own way. I think you have to go back to the basic demographics of the City of Toronto or the Greater Toronto Area. Since 2001, 1.3 million people have came to the City of Toronto and in its area, created 1 million jobs, or I guess, no, 800,000 jobs. This pace of growth is going to continue, and I think we have to face that. And you have, I think, really four things you have to look towards when you do that. The first is the housing and making housing affordable. I think we're reaching an affordability issue in the City of Toronto, which we need to discuss. The second is jobs and the type of job you get. When I was regional planner at York Region, we spoke it all the time. Residential will be a little easier. Jobs are going to be the difficult part. The third area is building infrastructure and investing wisely in our infrastructure. Now, we really are living on the infrastructure of my grandparents, actually. And then the fourth thing, and I think we're losing a little bit of it, you always have to keep what's important and in the best interest of the larger GTA when you're making these decisions. It's not the City of Toronto, it's not York Region, it's not the neighborhood. It's the public interest really does need to come back into that discussion a little bit as we move forward.
Ewan, I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah.
Welcome to Toronto, by the way,
Thank
your
you.
new role.
This is 7 days plus 2, so day 9.
So you could be the expert.
I'm absolutely the expert. Now I'm going to talk a high level and a generic level, but I think whether they're articulating it properly or not, cities clearly are offering some kind of value, right? We heard the statistics there about the population growth in Toronto. That's reflected worldwide. It was mentioned in the opening remarks for the first time in history, I think as of 2008, 50% of the world's population live in cities. By 2030, it will be 60% of the world's population. There's a reason why that's happening, right? There's a reason why that's happening. Co-location of talent, networks are becoming increasingly important in modern economies, particularly in mature economies. And the connectivity that cities offer is a crucial part of economic growth. I kind of find it amusing that, you know, the old technology story that we heard 10, 15, 20 years ago was the story of atomization, where everyone was going to work remotely and people would be able to live anywhere, and cities were going to become, remember that? Cities were going to become less important because geographic proximity was going to be made irrelevant by technology. Well, actually, interestingly, it's turned out to be the opposite, right? Cities are becoming increasingly important. I think political and taxation systems are slow to change, and there's a dissonance or a disconnect, frankly, between the power that the city has and the problems that the city faces, and many of those have been outlined. Infrastructure, how do you upgrade aging infrastructure, particularly in our older, more established cities where you are dealing with infrastructure that's several generations old, as opposed to some of the newly built cities, if you look to Asia, where you can start with a blank slate and you can install the latest technologies. But I think there's going to be increasing tension between the political and taxation systems and the cities themselves, and that's something that we see growing certainly in the United States.
Let me just pick up on a few ideas. This new generation, whether it's Y or Z or whatever label it has, is sometimes called the light generation. Rather than the big library they walk around with their phone or their computer on them, they are now the renting generation, whether it's bikes or whether it's cars. And we are the generation that is trying to solve the problem of cities for them. Let me ask this: how do we make sure that we're building cities for the future, for that generation, and not building the cities for our grandparents and the infrastructure that they needed?
So Sheldon, I just want to jump right in. I mean, surely to God, we are not building the city for them. Please, no. Don't we want structures where they build their own city? We're building our own city. I just want to pick up on Bryan's comment around, we've got to forget about neighborhoods and think about the broader city. The city is neighborhoods. And we need structures that enable people to participate. And I don't think, I would say, part of the other thing that I said to you in the corridor is that I think that I hope, and I think across the world we're seeing this, we're seeing the democratization of city planning. And that it's not so much you, with all due respect, planning the city for them. It's a way of creating collective mechanisms. We see it in New York all the time. The technologies now that are in those hands of those folks, what are you calling them, the light generation, that are carrying their stuff around, they have access to data, they have access to technologies, they're inventing stuff in their highfalutin offices to allow them to participate more directly in the city.
Are they engaged, Mary, in New York's planning?
Well, you see what, somebody asked me at the back, are you a planner? I'm more of an anti-planner. Some of my best friends are planners. You're all in the audience. I love you. But I think that it's more about how we create, and I think Jennifer's trying to suggest this, and I think New York is not a good example for what I'm talking about. I think that in New York there's been a kind of entrenchment of a more, I'm seeing you and smiling fondly at me, of a different kind of style of planning. I'm more of the, everybody would know this because we're from Toronto, where Jane Jacobs chose to live, where you find ways to engage folks in their own decision making. And I think they can strengthen neighborhoods, and we can find to aggregate that capacity and then create connected up systems. I'm kind of anti the big daddy approach here, where we're doing anything for anybody else, and that our job, it's incumbent upon us as people inside this kind of field to create enabling conditions for people to participate directly and make the city for them.
Well, I don't want to get into a New York debate necessarily, but
no, because I have to go home.
Yeah, exactly, and because we're not in New York, but I think it depends on what you mean by making the city, right? So,
right.
I think participation is really important, and partnerships are really important, and ecosystem is an overused word, but this really has to be about the not-for-profit sector, the government sector, communities, the business sector, large and small, coming together. And one specific example to talk to New York is about 4 years ago or so, the EDC, the organization I used to work for, launched something called the Big Apps Competition. And the idea behind that was to essentially surface data from municipal agencies, from New York's Transit Authority, and then put that data in the hands of these people, right, the light generation application developers, and say, okay, go away and use this data and use it to build services that will be useful to New Yorkers. And that's been very successful and has evolved over time. So I think those kind of mechanisms can actually be very powerful in terms of engaging people. I do agree, it's not about centralized planning. It's not. I think we've moved away from that model of centralized planning and control. It's about finding ways in which people can participate.
Yeah.
John, please.
One of the issues, though, and I'm very taken, as we all are, with sort of our organic notion of city as entity growing on its own. The problem, it seems to me, for Torontonians now, and it has multiple causes, but the problem is we have to be able to move between neighborhoods.
Right.
Our lives are extraordinarily complex. We don't all live and work in those same little neighborhoods that we're building. We don't send our kids to school in those little neighborhoods. We have to be able to get from there to the airport, to Paris, to New York, and so in fact, the organic model has limitations, and I think it's fair to say that it's perhaps one of the reasons that we haven't done any infrastructure on a broader sense for the last generation in this city. I think it's also, you have to remember the context. We have a city government and a national government that's sort of operating the way that companies do when they pay out special dividends.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
to their shareholders.
Large S.
Right? And
Yeah.
they're paying out those special dividends, they're cutting taxes, and they're restricting the investments. And why do companies do that? They do that when management doesn't have any idea what to do with the money. Right? When they're out of ideas, right? It's always a bad sign when you're getting a special dividend from somebody. And that's the time to take the special dividend and sell your shares, because the management doesn't have any sense of what to do with the cash. It doesn't know how to invest for the future, right? It's living completely in the moment. And I'm afraid that we have enemies of government running governments who have no confidence whatever that governments can play a forward role. We are also living through the aftermath of one of the biggest market failures in our economic life since the Great Depression, which is to say, business is not going to take up the slack. So who's going to do it? Well, the Ratepayers Association in the couple of blocks, in the annex where I live, we're going to do some great stuff. We'll probably have some good parties, but it's actually not going to solve any of the more fundamental questions for the city. And I think we are, in a period of visionlessness. The organic model is tremendously attractive, feels more like pulling the blankets over our heads rather than addressing the bigger issues of how do we make the city thrive for all.
I mean, I feel like you're sentimentalizing the organic model. I'm talking about
Perhaps.
something where people are heavily engaged and where you really when you're out of Toronto and you come back, as I do periodically, I'm just marveled at the dynamism of the people here and the ingenuity and how they're all distributed and doing all sorts of smart things. So we've got to create a harnessing capacity, right? I don't think that by saluting that means that we abandon some notion of large infrastructure investment that enables those people to thrive. That should be our job, is to create infrastructures that enable people to thrive and contribute. And I don't disagree with you that this jurisdictional stuff that we seem preoccupied to talk about in Canada, poor Toronto, the rest of the country, as we know, isn't that sympathetic. They might have been sympathetic to us earlier in the week, but they're not really that sympathetic to this kind of whining thing, John. So maybe we need new kinds of financing mechanisms. Maybe we need social impact bonds. Come on, you guys, Canada is leading the way on social finance. Do we need new kinds of funding pools? You have a lot of money sitting in pension funds. Do we need to harness those resources to invest in that infrastructure?
So Mary, in the back, you said don't talk about money, and you're talking about money.
I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist. John was suggesting that organic is kind of quaint
It allows me to then ask my money question. I'll pass it over to Bryan.
Well, I was just going to put my oar in the water in this too. And I think, as a city, we have to continue to be competitive and attractive to all residents, all people that live here. And I think if you want everyone to be able to live, work, and play in the Greater Toronto Area, it's all about choice. And I think we need to create choice. We need to create choice for the elderly people. We need to create choice for the young people. You have one small piece of that demographic projection that I spoke of is the Echo generation that are now, I think the oldest one's 39 or 40. They're starting to have their children. And they need to have choice in housing. They need to have choice in jobs. And they need to have a choice in lifestyles that continues to attract, whether you use an organic or... And it goes back to alignment, I think, what Mary and John are both saying, is how do we align all of these forces to a vision that will create a Toronto in 2051. You have to take a step back, as Toronto in 2031 will be the third largest metropolitan area in North America. That's the challenge we have in front of us. And it goes back to my thought of alignment, collaboration, partnerships, because we're all in it together, and then finding a common vision. And how do you capture and engage those people in a constructive, active way to bring forward a solution for this city that will make us prosperous and the envy of the world in 2051?
So let me segue into a different question, and that is that we've used the word partnerships, I think, 3 times so far. And in my business, every time you don't have a solution you can figure out, you use the word partnership, which means someone else will come to the table with the money.
That's like your trick.
So I would like to just press a bit about this partnership idea. Like, private sector needs a return on their investment. Who are the partners that are going to solve this problem other than the people through taxation? Tell me about the magical answer on partnerships.
You should jump in on that.
Well, I think to be fair to municipalities too, I spent 30-some years in them, is they really have three sources of revenue. They have property tax in Ontario, they have property tax, they have development charges, and they have user fees, and sometimes they get grants from senior level of government. So you have to take a step back. I think that's what Mary said, looking at the municipal funding model to see whether it's appropriate for the services that municipalities have to deliver in 2013. I know from our perspective, you know, we speak to transit, and we'll say it over and over again, the transit deficit in Toronto is not a new homeowner responsibility. So, you know, one of the big... Alone, exactly.
They do have some role. They are
They
going
do
to take
have,
it.
and I was going to explain what they do, is new homeowners in the Greater Toronto Area every year pay $1 billion plus in development charges to pay. They're the largest contributor to infrastructure in the Greater Toronto Area. So how do we take that and move it to different business models, different funding models, and move transit and other investments forward from an infrastructure standpoint? But I think it goes back to that fundamental issue, that property tax, development charges, and user fees is about all municipalities have to work with.
Well, again, somewhat simplistically, but from an economic perspective, everyone wants to only be the marginal payer, right? Whether it's business or whether it's individual taxpayers, everyone says, well, I just want to pay for the marginal cost of the services that I use. And in particular, in mature established cities with the aging infrastructure, we have this huge fixed cost base that has to be paid for, and an investment that needs to be made in order to make that capital stock current and appropriate. And the reason why partnerships are important, and I agree, sometimes people use that as an excuse for not solving a problem, but the reason why partnerships are important is because you have to bring together all of these different groups of people, whether it's large business, small business, individual residents through community groups and so forth, because everyone has to own a share of the problem. That's the only way you're going to solve paying for this huge fixed cost base, right? It's everyone has to own a slice of this problem, because everyone's going to be like, it's the other guy that should pay for that fixed cost base, and I should just pay for the marginal services that I use.
So, the frustration I have with this is you have some of the smartest people in the world working in Toronto on these issues. You have an Institute for Municipal Finance and Governance. There is nobody smarter than Enid Slack. She's probably here. She knows what to do. You have a collective group of people around her that know what to do. You've been having this discussion for 15 or 18 years since I've been here, and we're stuck. So I want to throw that out to the people that are here. Unless we can create some kind of extraordinary political will that supports a really creative, a serious addressing of this, some kind of different arrangement from the feds, some kind of new funding streams. You've got a premier that's speaking about this in extraordinary ways. The moment appears to be coming up, and are we going to be able to capitalize on that?
Are you suggesting a crisis might be helpful?
Well, yeah, thanks. They've tried that here. I just sort of lament the fact that it's becoming a sort of tired Toronto narrative. And I think that it's running in spite of the success of Toronto. John and I were talking about this. Toronto is an extraordinary success, and you just need to build a political will that's going to give you the kind of robust positioning. You probably have to come up with some smart new ways for the feds to get you some dough. And the province, you've got a friendly premier for crying out loud.
Would you say, just maybe to all panelists, that we got to be careful that after 2 days here, we don't re-identify all the problems? But
Absolutely.
You not only move to solutions, but the question is really the solution building that political will to just get it done and to stop talking about it? And if so, rather than identify the problem, tell me, what do you think the solution is to build that political will? Because we haven't been able to do it to date, obviously. John?
Sheldon, I'm absolutely right, and I couldn't agree more with Mary. I mean, absolutely right. I was struck when Jennifer talked about people feeling that they are paying too much taxes, or perhaps it was David who said that. And I think it's interesting because, of course, the whole economy is based not on deep factors of the relationship between raw materials and production. It's based on feelings. It's been how we feel about it. We feel now that we're heavily taxed. We're actually as lightly taxed as we have been in any of our lifetimes.
Yeah.
Right? It's an extraordinary thing, and to suggest that you have a view that we should govern ourselves in a more vigorous way with a higher level of pooling of resources directed against either issues of poverty or issues of beauty is to say something heretical. It's almost to be liberal. It's almost an impossible thing to imagine. But I think unless we shape a common vision of that sort, we're not going to be able to overcome this death of 1,000 cuts that we've been dealing with now for years. And it hasn't. I mean, it's not as if things have remained stable. Toronto. One part of Toronto has become extraordinarily successful, but Toronto has divided profoundly. When you look at the kinds of numbers that are being generated by the United Way these days, in terms of the collapse and progressive collapse of many of our neighborhoods, we really are seeing two Torontos. One which is profoundly needy and increasingly disconnected from the hopes and dreams and great opportunity of this city, and the other that's soaring and becoming a great global city. And I think part of the responsibility we have in shaping this new vision is reconnecting that Toronto and making sure everybody enjoys the benefits of that.
For someone who's new to the city, what's at the heart of the disconnect?
I think it really does. I mean, and this is you'd have to say a biased and ideological view, but I think it really does have to do with a business failure that neither government nor great fortunes have stepped into. I mean, we're sitting in a city that has billions and billions and billions of dollars sitting in banks that even a conservative finance minister will refer to as dead money. Right.
Bryan, I know you've been wanting to get into
Yeah, it was
this
interesting
conversation.
because when Ewan was speaking, he talked about crisis, and we just came back, some of the people in our industry, from Copenhagen. It was an interesting experience, and three things kind of struck me about Copenhagen. It's really not comparable. It's only 1.2 million people, and Toronto grew by that much in the last 11 years. But three things that kind of struck me is that whole region was in crisis 20 years ago. Lost a lot of their manufacturing, and they were forced to make a choice. And when that happened, they made a choice and they created a vision. There's still struggles. There's still the war against the bike and the war against the car, but they said we can't afford to build car infrastructure anymore, so we're going to become a sustainable city and use that as a platform. And then the third thing they kept saying, and it struck me as remarkable when you hear the conversation up here. Whenever you had a guide moving us around the city, they said, "Oh, we pay 60% tax." They almost like a badge of honor. And then the second thing they said is, "We trust our government." And maybe we have to work towards a platform to find that level of trust. But each and every one of them said, "We trust them to do what's in our best interest." And I found that really curious in the context of the conversation up here today.
Ewan?
I don't know what to say to that. I mean, I literally, I grew up in Europe, in the UK, but I've spent the last 6 years of my life in the United States, and even in a progressive place like New York City, the idea of people being happy with a 60% tax rate and saying that they trust the government is just phenomenal.
Well, Mary, what I do agree with what you're saying is that one has to build the political will to be able to make change, because without it, what we end up doing is having the same conversation over and over again. And if I link it, John, to your comment that there's two cities of Toronto, and And really, one city of Toronto, perhaps, and this is maybe a provocative statement, just doesn't believe that they're invited into this, into the rest of the city, and they interpret it as, will you pay the taxes for the rest of us? So now you're the mayor of Toronto, and you've got to share with that part of Toronto the deal, the new deal for them. How are you going to explain that where they are, that they're included, and that their taxes are, that you're going to ask them to pay, are actually to make the whole city better, and they want to trust you? What's your plan?
Yeah, I think that's precisely it, Sheldon. And I think you do have to have a vision of inclusion, and one that talks about principles of connection in the city, and so, you know, when we talk about transit, we're no longer simply talking about people in big cars moving around the city, but we really are addressing the fact that the reality in this city is that we've got this enormous swath of high-rises, as many as New York, or New York, I believe, is the only city that has the same preponderance. But in this city, there's been a tremendous decay in that great swath, and they are, among other things, profoundly disconnected in our transit system. Now, if we were to talk about transit not so much as privileging cars, but getting people to work, giving people opportunities that they don't presently have, I think the whole discussion would be less reactionary than it is. Because remember, I mean, the Mayor Ford was elected by the folks who are not connected to the growth of this city, and not connected to the global Toronto. You know?
So I just wanted to see if I can jump in on two here. You know, in New York City, we're talking, you know, there are these big system fixes and large investments in transit, but it's extremely difficult those things don't happen quickly, and they're extremely capital intensive. So in New York City, we have neighborhoods that are not served by transit and are not going to be served by new transit investments. So people are floating ideas like, and these are coming out of the universities, they're coming out of practitioners who are working in private practice and come up with a smart idea. That's one thing I think New York is very good at. Because there are so many challenges, there doesn't seem to be the same expectation there that every answer will come from government. And I think that we have many, many people here in Toronto that are doing smart things, and if we could create some mechanisms to flush the ideas out. So here's one. In the parts of Scarborough and Etobicoke, and I hope at the end of this someone's going to come up and offer to give you a little tour and take them out to Scarborough and take them out to Etobicoke. I was going to say by car, but even more useful for you would be to go by transit. And then you will see the extent to which there isn't connective tissue in these neighborhoods. One of the things that we're talking about very casually in New York is whether you could create social financing pools to create informal jitney services so that you would have flexible kinds of approaches. Here's why we had to come to terms with this. During Sandy, we did not have the capacity to evacuate our vulnerable populations off those coasts. And so we've had a crisis, which has put an imperative on us to figure out when the system goes down, we need redundancies. And I feel we could be a lot more imaginative in Toronto about addressing those parts of the city that don't feel well serviced. I totally agree with you, Bryan. It's about choice. And we shouldn't be punishing people because they wanted to have a lawn and live in Etobicoke. But at the same time, there are probably ways to decentralize the way, maybe participatory budgeting, do more of that. I know that some councillors here are trying to do that more aggressively. So you can do more investments in the local communities. They can invest in their parks. They can get jitneys going. And then you start to have a better sense that I have some agency. I'm not just passively complaining about those downtowners with the lattes, you know.
And if I could just follow up on that, because Mary makes a good point, and I think the point you go to Professor Olchansky, who's done a lot of work on the changing demographics and income, especially in the city of Toronto, where you find that the city core is becoming a higher, people with higher incomes, and what I'd call the inner suburbs, you know, Scarborough, Etobicoke, parts of North York, until you get into Markham and the areas farther north are the ones where the most disadvantaged and lowest income people are. So we need to look there too to find solutions to actually help move them around the city, connect them to their jobs, because they're the people that are running the city, you know, ladies and gentlemen, whether you want to think it or not, but they're the ones that are doing it. And I think we need to find ways, and talking about solutions, hopefully you'll read the paper Wednesday next week. We're going to try to offer one solution that'll actually, we hope, will build more sensitive housing unlock some of the areas along the avenues, and hopefully get family housing within that context. But we need to change regulatory requirements around wood frame buildings. I'll give you a little bit of a hint. I think that's the future, and one of the reasons we did go to Copenhagen and Sweden to learn how that's done. We need to look at different things, and we need to unlock the potentials of those avenues, something more sensitive to communities, because what you find, it's just the pro forma of buildings. You go 4 stories or you go 30 stories. So how can we make it happen in that middle range that'll be that'll line our incredible corridors with the type of built form that might include more families, a little less expensive, and really reap the transit benefits that we need to over the longer term.
So we're towards the end of the panel discussion, and I'll put out one hypothesis and then really allow you to take it wherever you want. It's this: as we are worrying about it and thinking about it, the city is still going about its growth. It's growing condos and units at minimum $500 a square foot, $600 a square foot. The condos are probably most of them under 750 square feet. You could do the arithmetic. You've got to have $500,000 to even get into a 1-bedroom downtown Toronto. Interest rates that are an all-time low. Question: what happens in 10 years if the interest rate is 10%? What does the City of Toronto begin to look like as we are building it, despite ourselves at the moment? And with that, what advice do you have to the audience, but really to the people of Toronto, to get us out of the stuck position we're in and get moving? So I'll just begin at one end. I'll begin with John and just go right across here.
I think part of that, Sheldon. I mean, presumably at 10% interest rates, there actually is a high degree of growth in the economy. I would hope we're not describing a version of stagflation with 15% unemployment and 10% interest rates. Although we are stuck globally. It is a very strange period in that there really is no economic account of how we got where we are and how we get from it. Yeah. We look at the Japanese, who have been in this circumstance now for almost 15 years, and many of us are concerned that this period could go on for a very, very long time. It's one of the other reasons that I think some of the great entrepreneurial ideas and community-based ideas that Mary has, I think will be very important for that city of the future. But I think also that we're going to have to generate this level of political will to do things on a broader scale. And we're also going to have to do as both New York and Chicago had been successful in doing, which is motivating some of the great fortunes of their cities over the years to get engaged and build something that will make a big difference for all. And that's not simply the work of the 19th century. You look at the bicentennial project, bicentennial project that Daley got going in Chicago, and it transformed the inner city and has become the greatest tourist attraction of the city. So there is a lot that can be done, and that really mobilized labor, government, and especially the big money that sat in the city itself. I think it's those kinds of solutions that will solve the issues of one where housing is less expensive, but at 10% interest rates, but mortgages are much higher.
I think you make a very good point, Sheldon, and it's one that our industry is going to talk about a lot over the next few years, and that is affordable housing. And I think we have to have honest, mature adult conversations around it that are fact-based. It goes back to the fact that if 100,000 people come here a year, you have to, by numbers in the family formation, build between 35 and 40,000 homes. That's just, I'm sorry, that's the demographic reality of the Greater Toronto Area. We see land prices now that are very, very high. In the suburban areas, it's taking up to 25% of the cost of a house. In the urban areas, one does not even know what it takes of a cost of a house. And that's all public policy generated. So we have to ask some questions around our public policy. Is it the right public policy for the right time, or are there ways that you can actually make things work for housing choice across the Greater Toronto Area? And then the other side of that is the employment, which we need to generate. And going back to just talking about things, I'm a planner by basis, I work for the building, but we need to do what the 3 Ts, I think Mr. Florida talks about them all the time. They sound, this talent, technology, and tolerance, and how do we harness the diversity of our population in those 3 areas to actually generate economic growth and development in the future. I really think my last message to people here is, I've used it a lot, is maybe we could regain some of the faith in the future. I think all the rhetorical discussion around things in Toronto and the GTA has sort of made people wonder what the future is going to bring. I see nothing but positive things coming to the city of Toronto over the next 35 years. So let's try to find ways to build a vision, regain some of that faith in the future, work together in a collaborative way, understanding that someone has to build, 35 to 40,000 homes in the Greater Toronto Area, and watch that future unfold in a way that we can all be proud of when we sit back and look at it 35 years out.
Mary, over to you.
So, the world needs more Toronto. You do so many things completely right. Strengthen your assets. Find ways to harness and galvanize all the smart social innovation. You're the center of a lot of these things. You guys live here, you forget this. But when you leave, and Ewan, this is all ahead of you to discover, yours to discover, Toronto is just chock-a-block full. You have the right stuff. You've got the DNA. We just need some of the right connective tissue. So the second thing I would say is we need to just connect the dots. How's that for an aphorism? Connect the dots, joined up thinking, to kind of marshal that kind of thing. The third thing I want to say is I've lived in 2 American cities, New York City and New Orleans. It's not all about what we might perceive to be high-functioning municipal leadership. It really isn't. It really isn't. In New Orleans, in the 5 years post-Katrina, there was this extraordinary dearth of municipal leadership there. But that city was able to rally and decentralize and build innovation at the most local level and cultivate its own resilience. And it had a dreadful relationship with the federal government, you'll remember. And yet it has managed. Cities will survive no matter what you or I think we want to do for them, Sheldon. And I think that to find ways for us to, as a city, collectively create new mechanisms to harness all that innovation through your paper and through your association and what Ewan's going to do at Mars, where social innovation is king. Over to you.
I think there's a global competition, right, for talent and for capital, which is increasingly mobile and increasingly centering on cities. And I think livability, whatever that means transit infrastructure, it means schools, it means keeping crime low, it means all of those things, parks, public spaces, and the way in which you pull together all those partners again. To create that livability is actually an economic development strategy, right? That's how you compete, because the only way that companies make investment, again, increasingly in talent and in people, how do they get talent to come and live in a place or to stay in a place to have their families there? They need to know that those quality of life factors are there. That then the capital follows the talent, and you grow the jobs base, you grow the tax base, which allows you to pay for your infrastructure investments, and that's the feedback loop.
Well, I want to thank the panelists. I'm watching our time. Thank you very much. I think if there was one message that I took is that it's ours for the taking, because we're a great city with a tremendous future ahead of us. And although the problems are complex, to use Bryan's comment, to have confidence in our future will take us a long way. So I want to thank you all for joining us and thank the audience as well. Thank you.